Welcome to Carnegie Mellon Online. For more multimedia from Carnegie Mellon University, visit www.cmu.edu/multimedia.
So, just to give you a little bit more context to how to frame all the stuff I'm going to talk to you about. So I did work at Microsoft for about 10 years, and mostly I was a manager there, team leader kind of guy, and I worked on Internet Explorer for about 6 years. And my job on that project is really relevant to this book, because my job there at the young age of 22 or 23 was to lead a project team in trying to come up with new ideas for how to make the web better. This is like 1995. This is the beginning of the web, for how to make the web better for people, how to make it easier to use, and how to come up with these ideas and develop them and ship them. So my job was to develop these ideas, work with designers and engineers and put them into specifications, and then help the team, lead the team in engineering that stuff and getting it out the door. So my job was innovation. That's what I felt my job was. That's what I was told I was supposed to do. The problem was I really had no idea how to do it. And I had a really hard time getting information about, well, how do you innovate? How do you manage a team that's supposed to be innovating and creating new stuff? And even though I knew a lot of people at Microsoft who had been there longer than me, and I knew other people in the industry who were inventors, people who worked on a Macintosh, people who had worked on Unix, as much as I tried to get information about what's the process, what's the plan, how do you do this, I found that most of what people knew were pet theories. They were stories and legends and mythologies. And a lot of them, even though they were experienced and had been successful, put a lot of faith in things that did not have a lot of substance. So at that time, I started saying, I got to get more informed about this. I want to find out, of all the people who have done this before I have, how did they do it? And not what do we think about what they did, not what do we mythologize or what do we put into the films, what did they actually do? So I started reading about Edison, started reading about Da Vinci, read about Ford. I started reading about all these people, and I wanted to understand what was their playbook. How did they think about what they did? So over the course of my career, this was just a side project. I wasn't really that interested in history when I was a student, even though I took history classes. I wasn't that interested. And eventually, though, I built this knowledge up, and I was successful as a manager. I worked on some stuff that I feel was good software, despite where I worked. And when I left Microsoft in 2003, my ambition was to write books. The first book I wrote was about management. How do you manage teams of people? Good book, did really well, did well enough that they wanted me to write a second book. My second book, I'm like, I got to write about this innovation stuff. Because most of the books about innovation are so focused on hype and mythology and romance, and that's not that useful if you want to be a practitioner. So who here wants to be an innovator? When they think of themselves and they're dead, they was an innovator in their field. Who here? Most of you, right? Certainly in America, innovation it's a high-minded idea. We all want to be innovators. So what I'm going to talk to you about here, it's a kind of a dovetailing of the stuff in the book. A lot of the stories I'm going to tell you are actually not in the book, but the themes are the same. So but before we do that, I got to do a little bit of, innovation trivia, just to warm you up and make sure we all, we know who we're talking about. So I'm going to show some pictures of famous innovators in different fields, and I just want you to yell out who you think it is. So who's this guy? Thank God, this is an easy one. How about this guy? Edison, pretty good. This is a very young picture of Edison. He's usually shown as a much older guy next to the light bulb. All right, we got this guy. No, younger than Galileo. Artist. No, Michelangelo. Bob Dylan. Newton, the apple is a giveaway. Okay, and we got this guy, another giveaway. All right, so we got 6 innovators, and there's one important theme. Look at the biographies of all these people. There's one theme that runs through all of them. Can anyone guess what it is? I'm sorry? Fell out of school. You're on the right track. She's on the right track. On the right track. Some people used to say bad hair. True. True. They're all men. Also true. Most of them are dead. Also true. But she's on the right track. So none of these people got a degree in innovation management. None of them read a book on how innovation happens. None of them took a creative thinking class. None of them followed any of the things that today we'd like to promote as that's how you do it, that there's a school or system that you have to learn. All these people had the same trait, which was they believed in an idea that they thought was interesting or they cared about, and they followed it. Sometimes to their depression, in the case of Van Gogh. Sometimes to their financial misery, in the case of actually Edison. Edison was not a particularly successful businessman. He tried to be, but he was not. So the key thing here is that we like to think that innovation is this grand thing that is only accessible to certain people who follow certain rules or have certain credentials. And the history of innovation says the opposite. It's often the renegades, it's often the delinquents, it's often the people who say, you know what, I am not going to follow what everyone else is doing, I'm going to go over here. So it's a very democratic notion. There's no official pedigree you have to have in order to qualify as an innovator in any field. Now, one problem that we have, though, is we like to believe that you need a pedigree. It's a very convenient and historic belief that only special people are creative. That the only people who can be musicians or artisans or writers are people who were gifted, who are born as geniuses or prodigies. It's a very romantic and very popular notion. So one particular mythology that's part of that romance is the myth of epiphany. And it's the idea that it's magic moments that define what innovation is. That if you have a magic moment happen to you, that's what determines whether you will have a breakthrough or not. And if you don't have a magic moment happen to you, well, hey, it wasn't your fault, just the muse did not bless you. So, story in Newton. Anyone want to give me the 20-second TV commercial version of the Newton Apple story? Anybody? 30-second version? Anybody intimidated you? I don't know. Yeah. Came up with gravity. Who here's heard that story? Does anyone know where they heard it? School. I was talking with Eden's class yesterday, and the joke I made was, where I heard it was Schoolhouse Rock. See? It's for those of you who don't know, it's a cartoon, very popular American cartoon in the late 70s, where they would show these educational things. It was a cartoon to break up the cartoons. Very. Anyway, that's the source for a lot of these myths. Carry on in all these places that we don't think of as educational sources, but yet we know them anyway. Anyway, this story is the canonical epiphany story, because it says that there's a singular moment in time when one individual, who as far as we know in the story was not particularly intelligent or gifted, by accident was struck violently by a piece of fruit, and that's why we know about gravity. Now, you guys are smart, right? I know you guys all got into Carnegie Mellon. It's not easy to do, or you're wandering off the street. It's hard to find this room. So I know that you guys are smart. But we tend not to think too much about these myths. They sit there in the back of our minds. And when we're not paying attention, they influence what we believe should be happening. So when you're working really hard at solving a problem and there's no magic moment, there's no epiphany, we tend to lose faith that somehow we're not doing it right. So the true story for Newton and the apple is a much larger, more complicated story. That it probably didn't even happen. Probably didn't happen. But even if it did happen, the real value of the story isn't where he was on the day he thought about gravity, because he'd been thinking about gravity for a long time. We didn't discover gravity. I mean, he was alive in the late 17th century. We knew about gravity for a long time before then. So the idea that he discovered something that late in history is kind of a ridiculous notion. But anyway, what he actually was famous for was proving the mathematics of gravity, proving the science behind how it worked, so you could be predictive about how gravitational fields work. And it took about 15 years to do that, to actually document all the math required. We don't fully know because he was kind of a recluse, and he wrote a lot of stuff on his own and didn't publish it until someone else threatened to publish. He's like, oh, I already did that, and he'd throw out a paper and had already done it. So we don't really know how long it took him, but it took him a long amount of time. And the value of the story to us, and why it carries on as a myth, is it absolves us. All these epiphany mythologies absolve us of the pressure of the work involved behind any breakthrough innovation we've ever heard of. There's another famous story about an epiphany. Does anybody know? Eureka. So what's the Eureka story? The 20-second TV commercial version.
I'm going to be an idiot and not remember the name.
That's okay. No, tell me what you know.
Archimedes, that was it.
Archimedes.
He was tasked with trying to figure out how much gold was in the king's crown.
Okay.
He couldn't figure out a way of doing this and was in the bathtub. And when the water overflowed the edge, realized that the displacement could be a method for measuring the gold.
Wow, that's pretty good. Pretty good. All right. You're a history major or something?
Yeah.
So how do you know the story?
I think my mother told me. And she
Your
was a
mom.
math teacher.
Always trust your mom. It's good advice. Okay. So she's actually got the story pretty right. This version that I get from most people, including very well-respected, intelligent innovators themselves, they say, there's something about a bathtub, and he yelled out something and ran into the streets naked. That's the version that most people remember. Anytime you can get someone yelling and running naked, it's going to be the parts that people remember. So it's another example of why is that part of the story useful. How, if you want to be an inventor, you want to have the next breakthrough in science, the next breakthrough in computer science, the next breakthrough in literature, how does knowing about the bathtub help you? It doesn't. It's a comical story that makes the whole idea of invention seem trivial. He was just in a bathtub. I'm in bathtubs. Nothing happened to me. All right, well, I guess I'm not special. I'm not gifted. So you can find these epiphany stories everywhere. You can find them in stories about business success. You can find them in stories of literature success. You can find them everywhere because they are comfortable, they're funny, they're entertaining, and they're kind of amusing. And they deflate all the work and all the stuff behind it. The actual true story of Archimedes is Archimedes was kind of like Newton. He was a scientist. He was an observer of the world. And he spent most of his life doing experiments and asking questions. And the problem he was trying to solve, we don't really know that much about the history because the whole way that story was told is actually pretty sketchy. But what we do know is that it's probably not the only moment he spent thinking about the problem. What probably happened was he was working at the problem, got kind of stressed out about it because he kept failing, took a bath to relax, and in the relaxation, his subconscious helped process the work he'd been doing, and he came up with an idea that he hadn't thought of before. So you can find lots and lots of examples of these. Now, one of the things that came up in research for the book, so the book's about innovation, but a big part of what innovation usually means, creative thinking. How do you invent? How do you develop a new idea? How do you find alternatives that people haven't thought of before? So in part of preparation for the book, and part of preparation for this course that I taught at the University of Washington, I became a student of the psychological literature of creative thinking. And I read all the journals I could find, I read all the books about creative thinking, and there's this popular notion about creativity that's reflected in these epiphany stories about there being, it's this discrete thing, that an idea is a discrete thing. And there's a moment in time, and you could just, if only you could control those moments and put them in a jar, that whenever you had this tough problem, you just took a thing, and it was like a pill, and you could just magically do it. And that's how we conventionally think of what creativity is. And when people who took this course, they wanted the same thing. They wanted to know, how do I manufacture an idea? Now, all the psychology behind creative thinking, and how our brains work and how we develop ideas, talks about the value of habits. That creative people have different habits for how they use ideas, and how they play with ideas, and how much time they spend seeking alternatives, and how low their inhibitions are to considering things that we filter out right away. The crazy ideas, the odd ideas, the scary ideas, they are more comfortable having the habit of entertaining those ideas for a longer period of time. So it's about habits, which means that really the question to ask if ever you hear a story about an epiphany or a magic moment, the magic moment isn't going to inform you. But what happened 10 minutes before, an hour before, a week before, what was that person doing? How does this magic moment fit into their pattern of behavior? If you can learn the patterns of behavior, then there's something you can probably replicate or emulate or borrow from or inform you about what process you need to follow to be more creative. So that's the first thing to think about, is habits. The moments aren't that important. It's the habits that lead to the moments. So in all these stories, it's interesting to think about this as like an iceberg, that we focus on these these little stories that show up in movies or in TV shows, but we don't talk nearly as much about all the stuff that had to happen to make that moment possible. So last little anecdote, just to see innovation trivia. Who here knows a story about the invention of the telephone? In the back. Yeah.
That's tribute to Alexander Graham Bell.
Okay. Do you know a story? Co-inventors. Okay. I'm looking for another anecdote. He's actually got a fact. I'm looking for an anecdote that people might. Anyone know a story? What was the first word said? Watson, come here. So who has heard that before? Watson, come here. Okay. Now, if you want to invent something that replaced the telephone, how would your knowledge of what were the first words were help you? Would that be helpful in any way at all? Totally useless information. So most of what we know about creative thinking and innovation it's largely trivia, which is fun, it's entertaining, would do well for you on Jeopardy, but not going to get you, it's not going to help you to create something that's going to replace these things that we know. Another mythology comes into play when we talk about science. And a lot of the science that we're taught, the way science is taught, is usually following in the footsteps of what's been done before. So even though the words experiments and scientific method show up a lot in science education, in elementary school and high school, it's very rare for people in those situations to actually get to do an experiment themselves, where they're asking questions that don't have clear answers. So when we talk about science and the scientific method, or rocket science and those things, we have a very biased notion as to what that means. Because if you're talking about breakthroughs in science, the patterns that they follow are much more familiar to our human nature than we like to think. So one of the best biographies, or it's not really a documentary, it's a nonfiction book about scientific breakthrough, is this book, The Double Helix, and it's about the discovery of DNA. And I picked up this book a long time ago as part of I wanted to know, how did these guys think? Did they follow the same prototyping and iteration cycles that I did for software. They have hypotheses and explore and invent. What do their faculty members, what do the research grant people say about their crazy idea? And this book is great because it has so little about science in it. It's largely a human story of a bunch of people who had an idea that most people didn't agree was possible, who pursued hunches. They pursued intuition. They followed very instinctive motivations for the research that they pursued. And it's backed up by science. I'm not saying they weren't scientists, but the motivating force was purely human. It was not a logic formula. It wasn't they followed, here's these 3 steps we have to follow. We're going to do number 4, and then we'll discover DNA. It was much more intuitive and ad hoc than that. And anytime we're talking about discovery or breakthrough, that is true, no matter what the field is. There's another side effect of the way we talk about breakthroughs, and that has to do with failure, which we're going to talk about a little bit deeper in a second, but I'm going to touch on it right now. That has to do with architecture and the icons that we use to signify great engineering work, the great pinnacle moments of Western civilization. And we like to talk about Greece and Rome all the time. We're kind of infatuated with them, and in some cases for good reason. But when it comes to architecture, there's a certain fallacy in the stories we tell. So this is the Colosseum in Rome. Fabulous building, wonderfully architected. And we like to talk about these buildings and talk about the Romans for how their stuff is held up for so long. These buildings are 2,000 years old. It's amazing. The problem is we don't see the buildings that were made really badly. You know why? Because they fell down. They're gone. They fell over and they were scrapped for parts or buried or used for other things. So over time, this is a problem in general history, but specific to innovation history. Over time, all the failures and mistakes that were necessary to create this building kind of get buried. They don't get talked about nearly as much. You can't go to Rome and visit. Here is the first attempt to make the Colosseum that fell over and killed 30 people. There's more too, right? Because Rome, we know that Rome had a large population, about 1 million people at its peak, 2 million people, somewhere in that range. And we also know we have this idealized notion in America, because whenever we see a movie about Rome, we focus on the wealthy classes, and everything's marble and beautiful, and there's buffets and orgies, and it's just like a pinnacle, wow, everything's pleasure and wonderful. Now that was true, but the problem is that was only true for a very small part of the population. So when there was a fire in Rome, during Nero's reign, there was a fire in Rome, and about 2/3 of the city burned down. Now marble does not burn. It doesn't burn. What does burn? Crappy wood buildings. So there's not a whole lot of history about the slums in Rome, because most of the writing that was done then wasn't about the crappy buildings. The writing was funded by the rich, wealthy people who wanted writing about their buildings. So, but this is a sketch of what we believe their slums looked like. And these things were notorious for falling over, for crashing, and there were lots of things learned in the construction of these buildings that paid off in the construction of the buildings that we know that lived on. Space program, similar story. And there's an interesting thing about, I'll talk about the interesting thing in a second. So one useful thing, whenever you're trying to follow the path of an innovator, trying to learn what's the thing I can learn from this success, you want to go back and ask, where were their failures? What mistake did they make that they learned something from it, then applied to something else? And you can find this everywhere. You can find this in the hot companies today. You can find this in the big breakthroughs of the past. So this is YouTube, right? Who here's used YouTube? Everybody, right? And we talk about YouTube, wow, it's amazing success. These guys, there's a startup, it was bought by Google for lots and lots of money, amazing. Well, it turns out that the story for how they started was that they were trying to come up with a video alternative to Hot or Not. You guys know Hot or Not? Who here has never heard of Hot or Not? If you're going to study breakthroughs in innovation, you got to study Hot or Not. It's the pivotal opportunity. You're missing out. So just to inform, the way this works, you go, there's a picture, and you're supposed to say hot or not, and then there's rankings for whose picture is hottest or whatever. Anyway, that's what they were trying to do. And in the course of trying to do that, they recognized there was a better alternative for the stuff they were building in this other, more general direction. You find this all the time. Another story is Flickr. Similar story. They started as a software development game company. They were making an online multiplayer game in like the year 2002, 2003. They went for about a year. They started to run out of funding, and they recognized that part of that game they were building was this chat thing that had the ability to share photos. And they looked at that and said, you know what? Even though we've got this game that we're building, this little thing, this other thing is it's not going to really materialize into something we can make a business out of, but this little thing, let's take that and make a business out of that. That's the story of Flickr. They made a mistake, they learned from it, they went in a different direction, and there we go. Other stories you don't hear nearly as much as the mythology. So Apple, way back when, Steve Wozniak was at Hewlett-Packard, started to develop the idea for a personal computer, and he was working at Hewlett-Packard. His first choice was to try and get Hewlett-Packard to make a personal computer. He didn't want to take on all the risk of being an entrepreneur. He didn't want to take on all that financial risk, so he went to HP and said, hey, I got this idea. They turned him down. Found his friend Steve, and they went off in their own direction and began that way. Similar story for the founders of Google. This usually doesn't come up that much anymore, but when they had their PageRank algorithm in the beginnings of what would become Google, they were looking to sell their ideas to a search engine. This is like 1999, 2000, somewhere in that range. And they were told by every search engine company, search engines aren't really profitable. Search engines are not really profitable. That's what they were told, which makes total sense for the time. In 1999, they weren't. They were a commodity. So they were told by Yahoo, and I think there was probably one or two other search engines, that they should probably go on their own if they had any shot of their idea ever materializing. So you always want to go back and look for the failures and look for the mistakes, and that's how you learn about the real process. And Apple, lots of stuff to learn from there. Apple, well, it's true, but it doesn't materialize in the press as much as it should. We love to talk about the iPod and the iPhone now. We don't talk that much about the Newton. Even though so much stuff was learned at Apple about how you make personal devices, that knowledge carried on and helped inform them for what they did. And there is apparently some software from the Newton that still lives on in the iPod operating system. And then, of course, there's other legacies that have to be paid. That the whole notion of an iPod, portable music player, personal music, was really something that Sony had the breakthrough for about 30 years earlier. You won't hear Apple say that ever, but it's the truth that there's a precedent, there's an antecedent in the breakthrough process that makes the iPod success possible. So we have this weird relationship to failure in America and how we talk about it, and it's usually only in special cases that you'll see an entire story about a failure. And Apollo 13 is one of these few examples. It's actually a fantastic film. It's actually mostly historically accurate. Did a really good job. Even though Ron Howard directed it, did a really good job. And but the story is a special case. Well, it's Apollo 13, so all the chaos and uncertainty going on here. Well, that never happened at NASA at any other time, really. You know, they knew what they were doing. It's rocket science, after all, right? Which is not true. There was chaos and uncertainty in almost every mission to some degree, especially in the early missions, where failure was done by design. They had to fail in order to learn enough to make the next mission a possibility. So to sum up this first section, I got one or two more sections to come. Always figure, you ever hear any stories on TV or in the news or in the media about a magic moment, the birth of the company, when did you get the idea? If you want to be an innovator yourself, you need to ask the follow-up question. What were they doing before? An hour before, a week before, a month before? How many alternatives did they consider before they settled on that idea? You ask those questions, you'll start to get data that's actually useful if you want to follow those kinds of patterns. Same thing about mistakes. You want to ask, what mistake did you make that helped inform you for the success? Now you're starting to get into like the actual craft of what it means to be creative, or what it means to work on something that becomes a breakthrough. So the second thing I want to talk about is understanding innovation history. And we're going to do a hypothetical example here. Let's assume for a second that all of us are working together on a project. So look at your neighbors and think about whether you really want to work with them or not. Okay. So we're working on a project, and our goal is to innovate. We want to break through in, we want to do Web 4.0. We want to come up with a new power, the next thing. We're so far out. We're 2 versions ahead. That's how progressive we want to be. So we make a prototype, we start writing some code or building something, and it starts to go well. So we start to make some other prototypes. And in the process of doing that, some other people who thought we were crazy were like, hey, it's kind of interesting. Can I come over and help out? It starts to grow, and we get more support behind it. And now there's more people involved, and we see message posts and blog postings about what we're doing. And all of a sudden, there's a name for it. People start talking, well, something's happening. We're on the way, we're on the frontier, we're making change happen. And there's articles about how this is the next new thing. We're in the cover of magazines. At this point, if we follow the general case for how projects like this go, what happens next is this. Nothing happens. And the reason why that's so frightening to us is because of this guy. So I'm going to take a little tangent here. Now, the tangent here is about exploration. So exploration and innovation, these are like 2 totally simpatico, pursuits, fields. There's so many relationships between exploration and innovation. And the problem has to do with this guy because he is the only modern icon, or figure, popular figure for exploration that we have anymore. All the exploration on the planet, for the most part, has been done. All the maps have been drawn. We know most, except for the ocean. We know most of what there is to know. And the only story that gets told again and again and again in movies, on and on and on. Now there's prequels, and we love exploration stories, but this is the prime model that we have. And the problem is, not a real explorer. Character, TV show, right? Now in a TV show, well, actually, I'm tell you about explorers. Now explorers, if any of you have studied the history like the Gama or Cook or Magellan, a lot of the time of exploration is spent failing, effectively. Because they look at a map and they get this map and there's only a little bit on the map and everyone's like, we're all here in Europe and there's all this black empty space with dragons and weird stuff. And the explorers say, you know, I don't really want to go to Spain or France. We've been there. I'm going to go here. And not only am I going to go here, I'm going to go here and find cool stuff. And I'm going to find cool stuff and bring it back. And not only that, you're going to pay me for it. That's what every explorer said. And they said this to royalty. They said this to people who are not, huge risk takers. They said, I'm going off the map. And as a byproduct of that, the point I'm trying to make is a byproduct of that, they spend lots of time, well, they're off the map. So you kind of wander around, there's no Google Maps, there's no GPS. So you get lost, you just keep going. And you think you're going in the right direction because of the rumors you've heard, but so they spend a lot of time at sea, lots of people dying from scurvy and starvation, and lots of mutinies, and lots of really unpleasant and mostly not that interesting stuff. The large percentage of exploration is spent doing mostly not interesting stuff. Work. It's just hard work. And that's the parallel to innovation. Most of what goes on in innovation is not nearly as sexy or as interesting as the highlight when you put the flag in the ground and you get rewarded whatever. But the problem with this guy, TV show. So what happens on the TV show at exploration? TV show starts, guess what? On a new planet. Poof, that's the first second. Second, 10 seconds in, some dramatic event happens, something gets stolen, somebody dies, some mystery happens, Spock disappears, who knows? And then what happens? Commercial break. So they have now sped through all the parts about exploration that are actually the real work. Teleporter, transporter, warp drive, these are all narrative devices to pass you past all the working parts of exploration. Now, so Magellan, what is Magellan famous for? Oh, see, too smart. Too smart. So had you been a less sophisticated audience, you would have said going around the world, circumnavigation. Now Magellan, as this guy is correct, Magellan didn't make it. He died about halfway through the trip. And he probably died as a result of a mutiny. It's not entirely clear. Apparently he thought that all of his troops were going to come to help defend the boat from the natives, and they all didn't come, so he kind of got killed, and then they continued the journey without him. And it's actually a fantastic story for exploration or innovation. The things that went on in that trip are just... If you know the Shackleton story of the Endurance, I think this is actually a better story. So I'll leave that for you. That's the one book recommendation I'll give you. There's a book called... do you know the book? Endurance. Not the Endurance book, the Magellan book. Okay. Okay. You're just into it. You just know, connected with the... Okay. Good man to talk to. He's got the epiphany power. Lots of the explorers died in a similar fashion or got lost, and lots of their crew died. So Cook, who apparently is the model by which Gene Roddenberry, a lot of his ideas for the show came from learning about Cook. And the rumor is that the reason why the redcoats, the people who die all the time on the show, the reason why they wear red is because the Marines in the British Navy wore redcoats, and they were the first people to go whenever they landed somewhere. So apparently that's the case. So Cook also died. He died somewhere in the Philippines, Hawaii, somewhere in that part of the world. All right, so all these stories that we hear about, every few years, there's this new technology, this new wave, and it gets hyped up in this way, like, oh, it's coming, it's right here, and then it kind of doesn't materialize. That's not the fault of the people who are working on the stuff. The people who are actually doing the work were probably not that, they're probably a lot more humble than the people writing about the work they were doing. So they were probably not that surprised that it took 10 years or 15 years to develop whatever it was. And if you look at the real breakthroughs in innovation history, the timeline between when the people who were working on it felt they actually had something interesting and it became a mass market, something that everyone knew about, is often 15 or 20 years. The mouse, the internet, cell phones, that trajectory between when the person was actually working on it and it actually became something that was a phenomenon that people would call an innovation or a breakthrough, it's a long period of time. I'll talk more about why we think it's so much faster now than it was. Anyway, let's assume for a second that we're lucky and we have a breakthrough despite all the things we just talked about. So something was happening, and then it happened. We discovered the cure for polio. We make Windows not crash. Something amazing happens, but we do it. And everyone starts writing about it, and the stories they start telling are now very different than the stories they were telling when we were still this ragtag bunch of crazy people. Because as soon as you have success, you now have to fit into the pantheon of all successful innovations and breakthroughs ever in history. There's a very long story of history for any field. And that history has so much stuff in it, they have to compress it down. On this date, this guy did this. On this date, this guy did this. On this date, this woman did this. You do something new, and as ridiculous or crazy or risky as that was, it now has to fit into this narrative that makes things seem obvious. So all these things in the past, this is from Wikipedia, timeline of communication technology. So you got smoke signals, you got Morse code, telegraph, telephones. If we invented something new that belonged in here, well, you know what? It would show up at the bottom of this long list. And to anyone who didn't work on the thing, of course Web 4.0. There's no real risk involved. I mean, there was Web 3.0, wasn't there? So how hard could Web 4.0 have been? Once you're looking backwards, the narrative we tell is a much bigger narrative, and we want it to be all consistent and simple. So most of the stories you read about previous breakthroughs and innovations are of this nature, that make it seem ordinary and simple and obvious, despite how complicated or risky it was to do. So this is an interesting example of a better history that still has the same problem. This is a diagram from my publisher, so O'Reilly Media. And they write a lot of tech books. Some of you may have heard of them, the animals on the cover. This is a chart they made of all of the diagram of all the programming languages and their relationships to each other. So you have C to C++ to C#, and all that stuff. And it's actually a fantastic work of design. This took a lot of work to think through and how you represent all this stuff. But the problem is that there's no language on here that was invented through using this diagram. This was not a tool used to invent. This is a tool used to understand or to feel good or to get some perspective, but it's not a tool used by inventors. So the view that we get here is kind of a godlike view, and it allows you to have judgment over what happened. So you look at this and you say, Object Pascal, what was that guy thinking? He got an inch. Shouldn't he have, if I were there, I would have known that Object Pascal was never going to make it. That's the perception that you get when you look at these chronological accounts. So the lesson here is that the chronologies are, like the epiphany trivia, chronologies and dates and times are often trivial too. They don't inform you about how that thing happened. So you want to understand what the person who got into the history book, what did they think of what they were doing at the time? What was actually going on? What were the risks they took to actually get something successful enough that eventually it would be seen as obvious and become part of the chronology? Okay, my last, let me just check here on time. We're good. Okay, excellent. I want to make sure it's time for Q&A, because you guys, I can see some of you are like, you're wrong. I got something for you. All right, last thing is about sociology. So this might be my last famous history picture. Anyone know what this is? This is a picture of a famous technological, sociological event. Does anyone know what it's a picture of? Yeah.
The Luddites?
Luddites. Yeah, so can you give me the 15-second?
There were British factory workers who rebelled against factories taking over the job.
Very good, very good. Who here's heard the term Luddite? Everybody, good. Now, in my circles, my professional circles, I was working in the tech field for a long time. The word Luddite is a slur. It's a bad thing you say to someone. When you say, why haven't you upgraded to OS 10? They go, what are you, a Luddite? You're like resisting the future. That somehow being a Luddite means you are, insane, you're nuts. You're trying to hold on to something that can't be held on to. So the word Luddite is usually used as a negative thing. And this gentleman is correct in that the story, the slightly longer version of the story, is that this is Industrial Revolution Britain. And there were people who made their living working in textile mills. They worked on the looms, and they manually pushed the looms to make these sheets of textile. And the industrial age was just starting up, and there was now technology that could replace these workers, automate these workers, and make the looms manufacture that would work on their own, thus eliminating the jobs and professions that these people had. So what these guys did, they showed up at work one day, and there's this loom there, and their chair's gone. They're like, what's going on? Their boss says, hey, we don't need you anymore. And by the way, not only do we not need you, but your whole profession is gone. Good luck. See you later. and they responded violently. It's not clear whether this figure is fictional or not. The guy's name was supposedly Ned Ludd, L-U-D-D. So he got the first sledgehammer and beat the crap out of a loom, and the other people were like, hey, that's not a bad idea. We beat up the looms, and what are they going to do? So they went around, they were kind of like a gang, and they were all rounded up, and most of them were killed. So that's the story of the Luddites as we usually tell it, but I'm going to tell it a different way. So how many of you have a job? Part-time job, full-time job? Okay, bunch of slackers here. All right. Okay, so you can imagine, those of you who don't have a job, imagine you had a job, and that's how you fed your family, and that was your career, okay? And let's imagine that after this talk, you're going to go back to work. Tomorrow morning you go back to work, and you show up at your desk, and you're all excited because you want to work on your work stuff, which you like. You show up, and there on your chair is a little black box with a little red light on it. Bloop, bloop, bloop. And you're like, what is this doing on my chair? Is this a present? Is it a gift for me? Then your manager comes in, taps you on the shoulder, and says, hey, oh yeah, by the way, yeah, we found a machine that does your job twice as well, twice as fast, for half the pay. So we don't need you anymore. And by the way, don't look for a job anywhere else because all the other employers are doing the same thing. So goodbye. Now, I'm sure all of you seem like reasonable people. But if you had that box right in front of you after being told that, I'm sure you'd have a violent response to the box. You would feel something emotional about that box and how much from your life that box was taking away. Now, the lesson here is a very important lesson about innovation. Because any innovation is effectively a kind of change. It is a kind of change where you might argue it's a positive change, that the beginnings of vaccinations was a positive change for the world because it reduced the amount of child illnesses or whatever you want to say. But there is change. And most people, by and large, fear change, especially if they are not volunteering to participate in the change. So if you're an innovator, that means you're introducing change somewhere. To your workplace, to your family, to your friends, to your customers, to your coworkers. You're introducing change somewhere. And if you're not aware of that change or thinking about the ramification of that change, your innovation is likely to fail. Now, in this case, there wasn't nearly enough power at the hands of these Luddites to prevent change from happening. But often in the workplace, it's a much more subtle kind of resistance to change. If I go to work and I have a cool idea, all of my coworkers might not like the fact that I'm presenting an idea that they didn't think of. It might make them look bad. They're going to resist that change. My boss might feel embarrassed that the best ideas are coming from someone that works for him instead of from him. So he's going to suppress those ideas. He's afraid of change in that respect. So there's this whole notion of the story of innovation being much more about sociology than about technology. And this is the thing that most technologists hate to hear. They get frustrated by the fact that even though they can prove technologically that their invention is superior, why it takes so long for people to acknowledge it or use it. And that explains why some of these adoption curves are so slow. Why the first cell phones that were made in 1978 and 1979, although they were kind of like bricks and had their problems with, but why it takes so long for these transitions to happen. It's not because of the technology, it's because of the sociology. So another reference here, this isn't my theory, although it's a theory I have a lot of affinity for. This theory comes from anthropologists. And there's a famous book called Diffusion of Innovation, or Diffusion of Innovation by Rogers. He's an anthropologist, and he set about looking at the history of technological advancement from an anthropological perspective, meaning he focused on why did certain cultures adopt certain innovations? Why did some adopt clubs? Why did some adopt better cooking methods? And his view was that that's really what precipitates or enables change to happen. It's cultural. Interesting theory. He looks at it from a much larger view. I look at it from a very pragmatic view. If you're introducing change in your house, in your workplace, in your class, you have to ask yourself, who is negatively affected by this change, and how do I negotiate that? How do I overcome that? How do I either persuade them or manipulate them or blind them, or in the case of the Luddites, how do I kill them and attack them? How do I work my way around that? If you don't have that toolkit, then no matter how powerful or amazing your innovation is, it may end up not mattering. This is a really interesting chart that I'm not going to talk about. I'll talk about it later maybe. All right, so my last story for you is the most pragmatic story that I have. This is about management and about breakthroughs, and it's also about culture. So let me get a sip of water and I'll give you the closing. Talk amongst yourselves for a second. All right. So we got this company. Who here knows what 3M stands for? Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. So, who here can name a 3M product they have used recently? Post-its. Okay, Post-it note, little cute yellow sticky thing, right? Minnesota and mining. Yellow sticky cute thing. Not that much to do with each other. Now we like to think of innovation like Google's an innovative company. They make all these technological innovations. But if innovation is change, positive change, or successful change, then a company that can go from mining to cute little sticky things, like wow, that's a sizable gap. That's really, they're stretching the boundaries of domains and fields and disciplines. So I'm going to tell you the story about how they got from mining to Post-it notes. And the short version of the story is as follows. This is the early 20th century. Industrial Revolution is still big. This is the rise of the skyscrapers. Steel. You need all these tools and machinery parts to make steel manufacturing work. So these entrepreneurs in Minnesota decided they were going to create a mining company to mine these tools used for grinding wheels, to like grind down metal surfaces for use in parts and construction. And they built this mine. They were entrepreneurs. They were young men. They borrowed a lot of money. They built this mine. It turned out the mineral that they mined was the wrong mineral. It was like the equivalent of fool's gold. It was not nearly as useful for abrasion as they thought. Mistake number one. They decided, you know what? Okay, we've learned a few things. Maybe we can modify this. We can go in a different direction. They had a big meeting, big discussion. And they decided instead of making these tools, they were going to make their own kind of sandpaper. The sandpaper seems really trivial to us now. But in 1911, sandpaper was a big deal. That was like, you know, if you could go and say, I'm a sandpaper engineer at a party or something, you'd be like, wow, you know, do you get stock options with that? Like it was like this is the rising industry, right? So anyway, they shifted to sandpaper. They had a bunch of other mistakes and problems. They were really not really that competent. But they persevered, and by 5, 6, 7 years later, they started a profitable sandpaper company. Not a huge rise, not overnight success, but profitable. Now the story begins, the important part of the story begins here where there was a guy who was actually a sandpaper engineer, a guy named Richard Drew. And he was working on a project where he had these prototypes for a new kind of sandpaper, and he was going to one of his customers, one of his clients, an automobile company. And they had this problem then of trying to paint trucks or cars two-tone colors, blue and gray, and how they could come up with a reliable way to separate the colors. So he's there and he's showing them the sandpaper. He's like, hey, what are you guys doing? And he gets really curious about this problem. He says, you know, I've never seen anyone solve it, but I think I can solve that problem. So he goes back to work, sandpaper engineer, right? He's got game, he's got skills. He's going to go and figure out what to do, and comes up with a prototype, doesn't quite work, another prototype, and he's working on this for a while, and eventually his boss, a guy named William McKnight, starts telling him, Richard, what are you doing? I'm dramatizing here, okay? I don't want to project a myth. This was a literal conversation. He says, what are you doing? 3M, you know, we are Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing. Two-tone paint doesn't fit in, so get back to work on the sandpaper stuff, okay? And Richard says, okay, yeah, boss, sure, and tries to go back to work, but this problem is sitting there. And you guys probably all had this feeling, you're working on a paper or some school, you know, thing, but there's this other thing that you're like, oh, I gotta work on that. So he eventually goes back and works on this. And he's told several times by his boss not to work on it. Now, as the legend goes, I can't fully confirm this part of the story, but it fits, so I'll say it, caveating it that it might be apocryphal, was that he was told several times, and eventually he knew that he needed a bunch of money to finish the prototype. So what did he do? As an engineer, he had enough budget authority to write checks, to write receipts for $100, and he needed like $2,000 or something to finish the prototype. So he writes those receipts to himself, finishes the prototype. Takes the prototype, shows it to the automobile company, they love it, shows it to his boss, who reluctantly says this is okay, and that was the invention of masking tape. Imagine a world without masking tape. 1924 was the year, the last year the world did not have masking tape. Now the same guy, Richard Drew, would go on a couple years later to invent cellophane tape, Scotch tape. Same guy. Now the important part of the story is not Richard Drew, although that's an interesting part of the story. It's William McKnight. Because all innovation, we talked about this at the beginning, all innovators tend to be delinquents and renegades, and they push the limits, and they break the laws, they break the rules. So Richard Drew's behavior fits that profile. But William McKnight is the magic part of the story. William McKnight looks at this, because he now has this cellophane tape business, this masking tape business, that their profit curve goes on a curve that's much greater than their sandpaper business ever did. So he has this new division that came out of nowhere. Not Minnesota, not mining, not manufacturing. So he looks at this and goes, you know, I screwed up. I'm the manager of this company. Our most profitable product now, product line, because then you got all like the special tapes and like the special dispensers and all, you know, the market expansion stuff. Hey, I wanted to shut it down. So if I'm thinking of this company, the future, I want to come, my management philosophy is broken. It's the opposite. I want a management philosophy that encourages Richard Drew, that finds Richard Drews and brings them in and says, yeah, you know what, even if I don't like what you're doing, I'm going to give you some amount of time to do it anyway. So William McKnight changed the company, changed the direction of the company, eventually became the CEO of the company, and made this a core part of the philosophy of who they hired and how decisions were made. So that's the story of how you get from mining to Post-it notes. Because that Post-it note was another part of their progression of breaking into new fields and trying out new ideas and allowing individual engineers the authority to develop things on their own. Now I'm going to read to you, I'm going to break a presentation rule here. This is a 3-paragraph piece of a lecture or paper that McKnight wrote about his management philosophy. I'm going to read it to you and I'm going to talk about it briefly. As our business grows, it becomes increasingly necessary to delegate responsibility and to encourage men and women to exercise their initiative. This requires considerable tolerance. Those men and women to whom we delegate authority and responsibility, if they are good people, are going to want to do their jobs in their own way. Mistakes will be made, but if a person is essentially right, the mistakes he or she makes are not as serious in the long run as the mistakes management will make if it undertakes to tell those in authority exactly how they must do their jobs. Management that is destructively critical when mistakes are made kills initiative, and it's essential that we have many people with initiative if we are to continue to grow. And not only is that much better written than almost any executive CEO speech I've ever seen or heard, it was written in 1948, or spoken in 1948. That's almost exactly 60 years ago. And this philosophy, as simple as it is very rarely followed by managers and leaders or parents who say they want their children or their employees or their partners or their spouses or their families to be creative and innovative. It's a very simple set of things he's saying here. One, delegation, which is effectively trust. William McKnight was saying, I have to trust Richard Drew that some of his instincts are right, even though I think he's wrong. Trust. Thing number 2, which is the craziest one, mistakes will be made. Mistakes will be made. Now, I worked at Microsoft for a long time. I do consulting now with lots of companies. I visit lots of places and do talks like this. And I know a lot of what management is based on. And it's exceptionally rare you'd ever see a manager or an executive, even in famous companies, who have in their business plan for the year, $10 million for equipment, $20 million for marketing, $8 million for mistakes. That's our plan for this year. We want mistakes to go up by 10%. That's our goal. You will never hear that said. So he put it in. It's the beginning of the second paragraph of 3 paragraphs. Mistakes will be made because we want to take risks. That means we're going to make mistakes. He's not saying that mistakes should be failures in the marketplace. He's not saying that we should deliberately tank products and sabotage each other. He's saying what we said before. You got to seek alternatives. You got to find what's the other way to do this. Let's try it out and know that we're going to learn. We'll prototype. We'll learn. We'll prototype. We'll learn. Then once we have more confidence, we'll make bigger commitments and actually develop products. That's really what he's saying. He's making a commitment that mistakes have to be made. And the last thing is about initiative. And he's recognizing that initiative is something that he can't foresee. That Richard Drew's initiative to follow this project goes against the view that McKnight will have as the CEO of what a valuable use of time is. So who here has heard of the Google 20% rule? Okay, so most. So for those of you who don't know, Google has this philosophy that all employees get 20% of their time to do whatever they want. It has to be a project it's owned by the company. It's not like they can go there and doodle or do knitting or something. But 20%, they're supposed to pick a project and work on it. Eventually those projects might become something that become a product. So Gmail, I think AdWords, there's a few others that were started as 20% projects. That's a great thing, and Google does a lot of things right. But this concept wasn't invented by them. It was invented by this guy. So somewhere in 1930, he created the concept of 15% time. So funny how we inflate these things, right? 15% time, where he said exactly the same thing. He wanted Richard Drew and every future Richard Drew Jr., Richard Drew Jr. III, the whole line of people, he wanted them to come in and go, you know what? My boss is wrong about this. So I have an outlet of time and resources. I can use my lab. I have an outlet of time for that energy to go somewhere, and I have the opportunity to prove my boss wrong. That explains... that's a very difficult thing to do. I was going to say that explains, but that's a very difficult thing for most managers who see themselves as being the center of control, very difficult thing for them to do. So I hold this up. Whenever I'm asked to come into a company, they're trying to be more innovative, trying to be more creative, they want to take more risks. He's got it all down in 3 paragraphs. And if that's the philosophy you follow, innovation will happen. Risks will happen. People feel more confident following ideas. And they will have no... they will be unable to complain that there's not an outlet for them to pursue the passion but the thing they believe in that no one else does. It's built into the system. So the last thing I'm going to say before I open up for questions, the last thing I'm going to say is, even though this comes from a management perspective, all of this stuff, or almost all of this stuff, applies on the individual level as well. Because most of us are trained. We're trained when we're children. We're trained through most school systems. We're trained through work to follow the rules. And we have a very critical view of ourselves when we make mistakes. If you want to be an innovator yourself or creative yourself, you have to find a way to allow yourself to make mistakes. Before you need the opportunity from someone else, you have to allow yourself to do it. And a lot of what came up in the creative thinking class was getting people to be less critical of their own ideas and to follow them further before they kill them. So there's an opportunity in what this guy was saying for anyone to become an innovator if they are willing to accept the fact that they will fail, accept the fact that some of the things they come up with will seem crazy, and accept the fact that, like the whole Apple thing, being an innovator or creator is something that it's a personal responsibility. No one's going to come and tap you on the shoulder and say, now it's time to break the rule. So I'd like to thank you guys for listening to me. And if you like this kind of thinking or these kind of questions, you guys, most of you have copies of the book. You should check it out. Because the book actually is probably better stories than the ones I told here. I try to save the good stuff for the book. Anyway, thank you for coming and for listening to me.